President Donald Trump will decide whether the U.S. will get involved in the Israel-Iran conflict in the next 2 weeks. The White House press secretary says Trump still holds out hope for talks with Iran. Trump has said he may or may not join Israeli strikes on Iran and has repeatedly called for Tehran to, quote, unconditionally surrender.
I have a message directly from the president, and I quote, "Based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks." That's a quote directly from the president for all of you today. No enrichment of a uranium, and it would absolutely not, Iran is not absolutely not able to achieve a nuclear weapon. The president has been very clear about that. And by the way, the deal that Special Envoy Witkoff proposed to the Iranians was both realistic and acceptable within its terms. And that's why the president is sent that deal to them.
Well, let's now bring in our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett in Washington, D.C. Kimberly, just 48 hours ago, it seemed the U.S. was on the brink of intervening on behalf of Israel. Why is the White House now deciding to wait 2 weeks? What's been going on behind the scenes?
That's right. Just 1 day earlier, the U.S. president was saying, I may or may not, and it felt as if things were imminent. The U.S. had moved in additional military assets into the region and was discussing about potential evacuation flights from certain cities where U.S. personnel are posted. Now we are hearing a timeline of 2 weeks. Now, the reason given from the White House press secretary is that there needs to be room for diplomacy. She says that that has always been the president's first choice, is diplomacy. And we know that there will be meetings in Geneva on Friday that will allow for some of that to take place with not only the foreign ministers of France and the UK and the EU High Representative, but also the Iranian foreign minister. And so this is significant because the U.S. president, while the press secretary says is not afraid to use force, the reason she's given is that he believes there is now room for that negotiation and diplomacy to take place. But very clearly, what she also stated is that any sort of agreement with Iran must mean that there is zero enrichment of any sort of nuclear capability. In other words, dismantling the program.
As you said, the Iranian foreign minister will be meeting with his French, British and German counterparts in Geneva on Friday. Do we know if there's any American involvement? Are the Americans involved in any diplomatic meetings at this stage with the Iranians?
The press secretary was not available in terms of giving forward Steve Witkoff, for example's travel schedule. But what we do know is that he has been involved in meetings here at the White House. There was a meeting that took place today with the UK Foreign Secretary, as well as the National Security Advisor / Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And it was understood that Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy, who has been very involved in these negotiations, and according to the press secretary on Thursday, is continuing to stay in contact with Iranian representatives, that he was also part of that meeting. And so we expect that the message that will be conveyed on Friday, that was likely conveyed today, is that the United States is looking for a path for a diplomatic resolution.
A brief one for you, Kimberly, before we let you go. We heard the press secretary say that President Trump was in constant communication with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. Is there any indication then that the U.S. has perhaps asked Israel to pause or scale back its strikes to allow time for diplomacy?
The press secretary didn't seem to give any sort of insight into whether or not the U.S. president has asked for leniency. But there's no question that the U.S. president himself has indicated, in addition to Karoline Leavitt, the press secretary, that there is constant coordination and communication between the president and the Israeli prime minister. And we should also point out that we know and have heard from some of our sources that also includes members of Congress with the Israeli prime minister as well. And as you know, there are many members who are quite hawkish on Capitol Hill who are still looking for some sort of military intervention. But the headline from the White House right now is that the president is pumping the brakes, if you will, and trying to give diplomacy one last chance.
Kimberly, thank you very much for that. That's Kimberly Halkett, our White House correspondent, live in Washington, D.C.